this is Ian Berry, and welcome back to another Sparkination conversation. Just a reminder that a Sparkination is a spark that ignites passion, that leads to action, that changes what's normal. Today, my guest is Johnnie Moore, and I first came across Johnny's work in this wonderful book called Unhurried at Work. And then we were a part of conversations with the New Artisans group. And then I also came across this wonderful little book, Creative Facilitation, which Johnny co-wrote with Viv McWaters. So, Johnny, great pleasure to have you join in this conversation.
Great to be here, Ian.
I guess the place to start, I love this idea of unhurried. A lot of the conversations that I host with my wise leaders groups of people, we generally don't have an agenda. And I guess we're practicing, having read your book, we're practicing unhurried to a degree, but I'd like to hear from the horse's mouth, my friend, as it were. What's unhurried? Why does it matter? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, the origin story of Unhurried is I was having coffee with a friend of mine, Anthony Quinn, in Cambridge. And he and I both like doing improv. We like going to watching improv and occasionally performing in improv. And we were talking about our experiences, and we were admitting to each other that when improv is good, it's really lovely and, very, very satisfying. But when it's bad, it can be really quite excruciating. I think I'd just been performing in something which was, from my point of view, the audience seemed to enjoy it, but I kind of hated it on the inside. It all felt very clumsy and awkward, and all the actors, especially me, were sort of tripping over each other. And we were doing the thing that I think less accomplished improv performers like me do, which is to put too many ideas into a scene in an effort to keep it going, to avoid silence. And you end up having just absurdity. You end up, as I like to say, two decorators go on a trip, marshmallow motorbikes to Mars. It just becomes crazed.
Yes.
And Anthony then said that he thought that what good improv had, what characterized good improv was being, he said, unhurried. Right. And I think the moment he said that word, I just thought, ooh, that's a good word. That's a really good description of good improv.
Yes.
That in good improv, it flows beautifully. It might not go slowly, but it flows well. And
yes.
That's a large part of what I think is really satisfying to the audience. It's not always that they come up with funny lines, but that you create this sense of ease and flow. So that planted Unhurried in my head. I suppose you might call that a Sparkination moment, come to think of it.
Indeed.
Because I thought, oh, might do something with that. Now, incidentally, at about the same time, because I was new to Cambridge, I'd been going to networking events and not enjoying them because they all seemed to be quite excruciating to me. I'm a bit of an introvert, and I just found it all rather painful. People would interrupt each other. Everyone seemed to be keen to be selling. You couldn't really make a connection. And that, there was one where people might introduce themselves, and one of the formats was you could introduce yourself and talk about something you were working on or challenged by. And the idea was you explain for 2 minutes and then you get feedback. And quite often people couldn't get 30 seconds into their explanation without someone interrupting. Have you met so-and-so? Have you tried this? I think it's that. It was all very alpha male, and I hated it. So I reached back in my memory for a different way of doing meetings, and I organized around, later on that same day, as the networking event, something where people would use a talking stick so that we wouldn't interrupt each other.
Okay.
So it's ancient process. Sit around a group of 10, I suppose it was, pass around a talking stick and talk uninterrupted. And we didn't have a theme. I can't remember why we didn't have a theme. I just thought, let's do it without one, see what happens. And it was satisfying. And I thought to myself, well, I'll call it an unhurried conversation. It's a good way to use that word. It was on my mind, so I called it that. Offered another one, and then another, and another. And before I knew it, I'd done, 100 of them. And it had become a bit of a thing. So that's the origins of my choice of the word, and that first sort of unhurried conversation as a way of practicing being unhurried. That was my way into exploring what unhurried might mean.
Yes. I guess it strikes a chord with me for the reasons why most of us would describe networking as you just did, an excruciating experience. And most conversations are like meetings. You know, they're not going anywhere, and they're driven by someone who's usually an alpha male. And what I wanted to do when I first started, I was forced into conversations in a way because I had some health challenges that meant I couldn't fly. And at that time, back in 2012, I was flying pretty much once a week. And I had to reinvent myself. And I thought, maybe I'll move to small groups. And I did that. Eventually, I moved to online about 2014 or so. And I discovered that you could do with the right people what you didn't do at networking and what you didn't do in meetings, and something magical was the consequence. And then I started, exploring, well, how does this work? What's underneath it? I've read everything I could possibly read on small group dynamics and everything I could possibly think about to do with, using Zoom. And in those early days, I was using Skype, and, long before Zoom came along, I was an early adopter on Zoom, and I just learned everything I could about, well, how do you bring the human element to the room? And one of the things that struck me with your work is that it's very conducive to bringing the humans into play rather than what they do. There's more about who they are. There is stuff about what they do, but who they are seems to be the more important thing. And that's what I've discovered is the key to, I call them human being-centered conversations as a consequence.
I think what I think was helpful looking back about the way I sort of stumbled into doing the conversations was I wasn't using them particularly in organizations. I was doing them as I call them a retail thing for anyone in Cambridge who wanted to drop by, and without a theme, because that seemed to work. So in that in that context, I was under no pressure to make anything happen.
No.
And so we weren't trying to accomplish a task. We weren't there to use each other. We really were there just for the satisfaction of the conversation with no other expectation. So I got a lot of practice at being in that kind of, I suppose the word is quite permissive, gentle, unpushy space. And, after you do 100 of those, you get a bit of a taste for it.
Yes.
And you realize, actually, it's very powerful and very connecting. And that at least some of that ethos is what's so easily missing in, and I think this is where I align with you, it's so easily missed in organizations because, so often on the internet, if you look up how to have good meetings, there are lots of vehement posts saying, always have an agenda, never go to a meeting without an agenda. And I always go, whoa, steady on. That's a bit much. I'm sure, I understand that the pain that recommendation comes from, because, I'm sure there are a lot of meetings where they appear to be going nowhere. But it's a subtler business being a human being than being a computer. And, we need some, oddly enough, to use a technical, an IT word, some bandwidth, create some emotional bandwidth between each other, some sense of tuning in and feeling a sense of belonging at a very human level.
Yes.
Because when that's there, people will actually start to share more and more interesting thoughts, and you'll have a more creative and probably in the end, if that's your purpose, a more purposeful conversation.
Yes, we always begin our wise leaders conversations with a check-in, and people spend 30 seconds talking about their state of being, and then 30 seconds on what they're working on. And because up until recently, we a lot of the groups met weekly. And so there was a continuity. We now meet twice monthly, but it's the same thing. It's about the continuity of it, and it introduces the human up front. Even when we've got a theme, which we do as well, but most of the conversations are no agenda. And I think the interesting thing that's emerged for me when you put the human first, as you were alluding to, you get deeper conversations, you get more meaningful conversations, you get more, I guess, depth of conversations than you would otherwise. When I first started doing this in 2012, a few of my clients cottoned on to the idea and asked me to come in and, would you mind sitting in on our meetings and telling us how good or bad they are. And often I'd sit to the side, and I don't know how many times this happened. It happened so many times that I ended up changing my own modus operandi. But I'd raise my hand and I'd say, "Look, excuse me, but I'm not sure why we're here. What is the purpose of the meeting? If we're just here to have a conversation, then great. But I understood we were here for a particular purpose. What is that purpose?" And very rarely could anyone answer the question. And of course, the real agendas in those kind of meetings were driven by whoever was leading the meeting. I understand if you go to a meeting with Jeff Bezos, you've got to put a PowerPoint slide back before you go to the meeting. I couldn't think of anything worse. But so there's all kinds of approaches to conversations, but what interests me is those that bring out the real human who's on the screen or in the room. Over those 100 and since then, are there common things that emerge that seem to be part of all the unhurried conversations, or is it a continuing list?
Well, I suppose it's I'm smiling because I was going to say, it's a fairly familiar experience. I think one of the familiar things is when I'm doing one in person, I might be cycling to it in Cambridge. I'll often be cycling to it in a bit of a rush, thinking, why have I agreed to do this? I've got too many things to do today. So I arrive in a bit of, what's the point of it sort of mood. And then 3 minutes into the process, I just feel my whole energy sort of drop down a couple of chakras, if you like. Yeah. And I go, oh, yes, I needed this. I didn't realize I got something from it that I didn't realize that I needed, which is just that sort of sense of being in a room with fellow human beings, each of whom is trying to make sense of the world. Which we sort of forget, I think, in our busy lives.
I think we do.
That life is, an extraordinary, mysterious, complex thing, and everyone is trying to make sense of it. Now, if you rush about, it looks like everyone's already made sense and is busily, purposefully doing stuff, but you sit down for a few minutes in an open format and you go, oh, well, this person's dealing with this person's dealing with that person's trying to make sense of their broken relationship, this person's trying to use the color of paint for their house, this one's got a new cat, how do you feed it? We're all kind of going, we're all kind of improvising our lives and trying to make sense of them. And, I mean, this might be apocryphal on my part, I don't know, but I tend to have this idea that before advanced civilization, I think we all moved in tribes of 20 or 30 people, and that would be the number of people you meet in the entirety of your life. You would be in constant companionship with them. Yeah. And you wouldn't be hunting all day. You'd hunt for a bit, you'd catch your meat, and you'd have a lot of time to schmooze. And that default sense of belonging was kind of baked into our physiology. Yeah. And I think we've got a bit, I'm going off on a tangent here, but you'll forgive me, won't you? But, that need to get back to our kind of rather campfire way of being. I think that's the whole, pretty much every time I do it.
It's the whole purpose. A lot of the folk that in my conversations, say it's just, I ask them, why do you keep coming? And the answer most often is, I just enjoy hanging out with human beings who are talking about stuff that's real and what matters.
Yeah. And the what matters is interesting, isn't it? And it's quite a subtle thing, because I think one of the things I noticed, particularly with we might talk about using this process in organizations, but in the native sort of retail environment, yes, the what matters you have to interpret very kind of gently, because one of the characteristics that I like is the conversation go from what you might think are quite light things to quite deep things and up and down. So some of the conversation will be about, I tend to say, about people's cats. Yeah. And then you might find it turns to something really quite deep and emotional, someone's eating disorder or bereavement, and it can flow, and we can have all of that. Yes. And there's a capacity to hold all of those things. Because one of the things that I think is nice about Unhurried is, I think the way I try to set it up is not to make it, to use a fancy term, too portentous. Because you can do circle practices in a way that slightly suggests to people, well, it's very important that you speak from the heart, respect the other listeners, and you can end up in this sing-songy way of setting it up, which, or even describe it, makes me slightly fidgety, because it's like, oh, if I better say something deep then, or I can't take part, and that's not very natural.
No.
So there's that capacity. So back to your earlier question about what I think characterizes this process is that wonderful capacity to contain all sorts of very different sort of levels of conversation. So it doesn't have to be deep the whole time.
No, and I think what emerges, of course, in that process is natural humour. Because all those things from the person's cat to the person's eating disorder, they're all human. The guy that's talking about his cat loves his cat, otherwise he wouldn't be talking about his cat. So it's and the ordinariness in that. I mean, I'm sure you would agree that most of the profound things in life are in the simple and the ordinary.
And yes, and there's a sort of thing which I've been thinking about a bit more recently. There's a kind of thing. There's a thing of sort of, there's a kind of resonance that happens, which I've noticed, which is, I remember sharing some experience the other day, and then the next person decided, they didn't have to, but they decided to say something in, that they'd understood from what I'd said. So they kind of said what they thought what they'd taken from what I'd said and put their own slight spin on it. And I listened to them recapitulating my idea, and I thought, oh, that's really good. I like my idea more now. I've heard it through your lens, in your voice, with your slight tilts on it. And so instead of laboriously adding bricks to each other's conversation, the way you do in a meeting where you're trying too hard, you go, well, to your point, I'll add this, trying to rather politely make sense. Sometimes we just repeat each other with a bit of echo and resonance, and that can. I'm even telling you, I feel excited because there's something I can feel it in my heart, that there's a sort of flutter in my heart at those moments, because I feel like, oh, now I'm in a kind of field of connection. I'm not alone. We're in this together in some way.
And there's a naturalness to that, which I think is deeply human. Probably for the reasons you suggest, going way back to our beginnings of just being around 20 or 30 people. It would have been a boring life around 20 or 30 people if you didn't talk to one another.
Yeah.
And I think
hard to imagine. Yeah.
I think, there is now a deep need, because what's happened from my eyes is that everyone's connected, but not in the heart. And human being centered conversations connect us in our hearts as well as our minds. A lot of the stuff, there's so much noise out there. I mean, I've dropped all social media except LinkedIn, and I'm even thinking about dropping that.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm on a similar.
Because it's just noise, and I'm not sure that it has a lot of value. It's one of the reasons I moved my writings to Substack, because I'm writing to people who want to read the writing. Whereas on LinkedIn, you're never sure about who's, because their algorithms do their own thing to benefit LinkedIn. Now, I think LinkedIn, the reason it remains is I think it's the best of a bad lot, personally. But I'm more interested. I'm more interested in. I don't want to be connected, particularly when someone connects with you and you think it would be a good idea to connect with them, and then the next day you get a sales pitch from them.
It's I'm on a similar path, I think. I've had an intermittent relationship with Twitter, and I'm currently, rather like someone trying to give up alcohol intermittently, I'm on a 2-month sobriety with Twitter, and I feel so much better for not being on it, because I find that a real, as my friend Ewan Semple calls it, it's an indignation machine.
Yes.
And yes, the noise and everything.
I certainly don't miss it. I was fortunate enough I didn't cop it. I was not backward and coming forward, but I didn't cop any abuse or anything like that. But I just got tired of the negativity.
Well, I think I think the journey that I'm on is, I started talking to my friends about unmarketing a few years ago.
You and I are on a definite path in that regard.
And lately I thought I almost want to call it anti-marketing. Because and it's interesting because I used to work in advertising, so I have a marketing background, right?
Yeah.
And I used to quite happily do, lots of mail shots and turn the marketing engine over for myself and for other people. And I've started to think that for some of us, not necessarily for everyone, I don't know, we almost need to do almost the opposite of all of that. Because I think we end up in fighting each other for attention. And
True.
And people look like they're all rushing about, but you might not guess from they're rushing about that what we all really want is someone to pay attention to us, to give attention.
That's true.
And I started to think that a good conversation creates what I think a good conversation does is it creates an abundance of attention. It allows everyone to feel that they are getting attention. And I think when we're tuning to that way of listening, which is not a forced listening, but a relaxed listening, we are listening to the other people and we're listening to ourselves. So as a group, we're creating this pool of attention to each other, which is, I think, deeply sustaining and a quite powerful antidote to, well, to put it bluntly, to late stage capitalism, which is a machine that's, relies on keeping us all agitated and, in a scarcity mode, because then we'll consume more things.
Yes, it's a couple of interesting things that come to my mind in hearing what you're saying. And first is Bernadette Jiwa, who is a well-known marketing author in this part of the world. She's from Ireland originally, so she can tell a story like there's no tomorrow. In fact, she's just started producing novels. But I love Bernadette. She introduced me to the idea that marketing is just a series of helpful conversations. And that really changed everything for me. When I'd call someone, I'm lucky that almost all of my business is referrals of some kind. But when I talk to past clients or current clients, just, how things going call, I find that if I focus on being helpful for them, then the conversation has a lot of value for them and for me. And if it leads to something else, then it does. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And I realized the other day that there's, I've got enough people who are already known to the kind of conversations that I have, and I'm just going to this year. I'm just focusing on those people. I don't need any more people. And I think when I made this decision, I had a kind of. Well, I think my heart might have stopped momentarily because it was a bit of a gasp at the start, because I thought I don't have to do any more sales letters or anything of that nature, really.
Yeah.
I've just got to keep having helpful conversations with the people I already know.
I think one of the things about that approach, which I think I'm getting better at, because I've been programmed with the other way of doing things so deeply that it takes a lot of practice to sort of let that go more and more.
Yeah.
But I think one of what that approach you're describing does is it allows us, you and I, when we're practicing it, to be nourished by the conversation.
Yes.
And to ask so I've been asking myself, well, what will nourish me? Because on a bad day, I'll go, oh, I need to make more money. I need more work. Why haven't I got more? How can I make more work happen? And, that will set off. That will sparkinate, if I can keep pinching your word. Also, it was often quite a dispiriting and not very successful, slightly frenzied behaviors.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to ask myself lately, well, what nourishment do I need?
Yes.
And that makes a very different set of things occur to me. It's like, well, perhaps I need to talk to someone I know, have someone have an hour on Zoom, a virtual coffee with someone, talk over ideas, and as I describe that to you, oh, well, that's being more like my, again, possibly mythical and apocryphal, tribe of 30 way of behaving. You wouldn't in the tribe of 30 be waking up on your own thinking, how can I make an impact today? You'd be blundering into your tribe members and shooting the breeze and kind of figuring out together what to do. You'd have that sense of belonging as a default. And maybe it's an age thing for both of us, but I increasingly think I want to operate in that way of being, I think.
Yeah, and I think it can add value to all aspects of life. I mean, just a simple example, my wife and I we take a daily walk with our dog. It's about 2 kilometers.
Oh.
And we usually take the walk itself would take 20 minutes. But we go out of our house and we walk past 2 of our neighbors, and then we turn into a forest. And then we turn left a little bit, and we're behind a lot of our neighbors' houses then, and they all mow the grass and tend the various native things. So for about 1 kilometer, we walk in that environment, and then we're more out in the open again, and then we come back into the forest and come home again. But what's happened over a number of years is those walks can take 2 hours or more, because we're having, in your words, unhurried conversations with our neighbors.
I went off in a little reverie as you described that. I found myself relaxing at the thought of it. I felt a tiny bit envious, I suppose, but I also felt like it sounds so nice. Yeah, well, it's so human.
We get nourished, and our neighbours do as well. I remember just a couple of days ago, we left home for our walk, and we never got past our next door neighbours. I mean, their dogs get on with our dog, and the dogs played, and we had a conversation.
Yeah,
and we almost forgot about going for our walk. And to me, there's such a humanness in there, and I love your word, nourishment. It's a word that I've been asking a lot of. I haven't used the word, but I'm going to start using the word. I'll pinch it off you, because I've been asking, what do you really want? To feel as if you belong, and something that's really valuable and meaningful for you. What you want that we're not already doing, and there's been some great feedback from people as I've asked that question. But this idea of nourishment, I think the world is in need of nourishment of the kind we're talking about.
I'm getting that resonance thing. So it's lovely to hear you use that word and try it for size and think about using it. And the effect on me is, oh, yes, that is a good word. I might think about that more. So it's interesting. It's interesting because the conventional language is that you want to pinch it from me. But of course, what we've created by bouncing it between us, I think, is we both got a bit. It's a win-win, isn't it? Because I'm enjoying it more than when I just told you about it, because we bounced it to and fro, and it's sort of now an idea between us.
Well, that's right. And I think when you were speaking, I felt it, which is what happens in these human being-centered, unhurried conversations, is we feel the language. We don't just hear it. We feel it. And I think that's what's missing in many organisations. So let's talk about that for a moment. Have you taken your process into organisations? And if so, what's happened?
Yes, I have. I mean, even before I called it Unhurried in Cambridge, it was a way of working I'd occasionally used in my day job as a facilitator in organisations. And back then, I had sort of mixed experiences of it. It would work occasionally. I didn't use it very often because it is weird if you're not used to it. And in an organisation, people haven't volunteered to come, which is a significant difference. If I invite you to an Unhurried and you come of your own free will under your own steam, that's a very different set of permissions than if I turn up and you have to come because this is the regular meeting and I'm there doing it. And it would sometimes not work very well because it was too forced and awkward, and people felt, with hindsight, I think quite justifiably, wary and suspicious. So I'm quite careful when I use it. I don't go in using it cold. I might work it into a day's work with people if I kind of feel like it might fit. If I feel like I don't know, to put it a bit clumsily, if the group's warmed up and if I feel there's some goodwill in the group and they've decided I'm not a complete idiot and they trust me, I can bring it in. And then I've had some amazing experiences with it, some really amazing things. I hate to use the phrase in my book, but here I am using it. I write about one of them in my book where I was working with a group of people on a rather complicated entrepreneurial project where there were stakeholders from all over Europe come to London for the day. And we'd spent the morning doing various activities. And we had an unhurried conversation in the afternoon, and it got quite difficult at one point because one of the participants said, he was from one of the Scandinavian countries, and he said something like, well, I came here this morning with my business partner, very optimistic because of the people that have been gathered here today. But I must admit that I'm now feeling anxious and disappointed. It feels like we haven't agreed a common purpose. And he carried on like this. And he was very Scandinavian about it. He was being very direct but respectful in the way he described it. So it wasn't like whining, but he was clearly saying there's problems here. Yeah. And when it finished, I thought it was a tea break. During the tea break, I sort of worried a bit about, I don't know what to do about it. And the chairman chatted, what should we do? What should we do about it? And I kind of think I said, I don't actually know. But in my body, some part of me was going, don't panic. Some part of me knew not to overreact. So I inhibited myself. And I think before I'd been practicing Unhurried for 10 years, I might have tried to fix this, and I would have almost certainly messed things up. So when we came back, I just said, well, let's continue the Unhurried conversation. And the next thing that happened was the guy's partner picked up the talking object and said, Sven and I have decided to spend 250, I think it was 200,000 euros on this new product. It was like, oh, so they'd worked on the solution themselves during the tea break, I guessed. They'd gone, well, now I think, and I think I don't know what happened, but I think what might have happened, what can happen in an Unhurried conversation is when you speak and people are listening and you're not interrupted, you hear yourself differently. So what you say changes. So by the mere act of sharing with people, your thinking can then grow and develop. And he probably talked to his partner and they thought, well, perhaps the best thing to do would be to commit to something and see what happens.
Yeah.
And the conversation spooled up from there. And actually quite a lot of people started making various kinds of commitment statements. And I hadn't asked for commitments. That's what's so beautiful about it. It emerged naturally.
Yes.
So that's my go-to of how it can work. On a good day, when you've got the wind behind you, it can generate really amazing and surprising actions. I mean, that's the thing I really want to emphasize, because the people who insist on agendas hear about a process like this and get very upset because, well, how will that lead to anything? But I think it can lead to really what my friend Chris Corrigan calls wise action. Action that feels like it has some heft and ground because it hasn't been forced out of people. And that's a bit like marketing, which is always trying to force us and rush us into doing things. It's like they actually found something that they want to do and then they do it. And that was an action literally in the meeting. That wasn't an action plan. That was, we are committing to buying this.
Yeah, which is wonderful. And I think that's the naturalness that's how we were meant to communicate. And when we create a container that's safe, even when I've had many moments of anxiety like you talk about, but what I've learned is to trust the process. Another thing I've noticed in you in being centered conversations, for example, is silence. We all of a sudden there's a silence. And it can be the longest silence I've had in a meeting was 11 minutes. And even I was getting nervous.
Yeah, that's long.
But they're usually, 30 seconds or maybe a minute. But on that day of 11 minutes, the most junior person in the room was the first person to speak. And what she said changed everyone's lives forever.
I love those things. I love those moments. And I've had a few of those. I think it can't happen
unless we're being human.
What I think the hundreds of Unhurried conversations have helped me to do is I've got much better at sitting with silence and sort of maybe smiling and not feeling under so much pressure to fill the awkward silence with my own. And I often say, and this echoes exactly what you've described, Ian, that I find that if I sit with, and it's sometimes uncomfortable for me, it's not as easy as it looks. Especially if I'm doing my job and I feel under pressure to make something happen. So often when I do that, the next thing that's said is so much more interesting, surprising than anything I might have said.
Yes.
Yes. And then in my turn, sometimes I'll break the silence I'll be the person that sometimes breaks the silence with something that needs to be said. But you have to wait for it.
You do.
And I think there is something sacred about that silence.
There is, and I think there's a key part of respect in that process as well. I mean, when I'm in my groups, the majority of people are used to it, so it happens very naturally. When I work in organisations, I generally frame it by saying something like, there might be moments of silence, and that's okay. Because what often happens is when we have that time just to sit with our feelings and thoughts, something profound will come from someone, and we need to trust. Because I've never not had something profound that didn't occur after a period of silence. So when I'm working with organisations, that's what I tend to do. But yeah, it's a very powerful tool, and it's what happens when we've got friends over for dinner, right? There are periods of silence.
Yes.
No one
yes.
cares.
Or imagine, walking with your wife. I'm sure there's long chunks where you're just walking.
There's moments of silence. When we're talking to our neighbours, there's moments of silence. It's a part of being human.
Mm.
I wonder what else, Johnny, if you had to, if you couldn't do conversations anymore and you wanted to pass on what you've learned about conversations, what would you pass on?
Ooh. What I found myself thinking was that would be awful.
Yes,
I'd love to do it, but I suppose the wisdom I think that it points to is practice. There's no substitute for just doing practicing and paying attention. So that there's we can write books and tell people how, and describe the principles of conversations, all of which is all right. There's no substitute for the constant experience and the practice. And when we're talking about silences just now, I realize in those silences, I kind of have to say to myself, oh, it's one of those silences. I'm going to have to practice.
Yes.
Not saying something trivial to break all this up. I'm going to practice waiting. And it's a little bit anxious making and uncomfortable, but I have to practice and get better at it with practice.
Yes, I agree.
So I think it's, conversations between people are rich, complex things. There's always new things to notice and observe. So I don't want to say stay alert, because I don't think I want to counter the idea that we have to do active listening, because I think a lot of training that makes me feel very anxious. We have to get a kind of, the phrase I want to use now is, I picked up from somewhere, soft vigilance. Practice soft vigilance. Notice more.
Yes, that's a great phrase. Now, I did want to touch on one element that I'm sure has been a part of your experience to sort of round our conversation out, but stories.
No.
Where do they fit? I've got my own views, but I'm interested in yours, because they're probably the key to the best conversations.
Yeah, I've been thinking more about this, and I haven't really got very well thought out thoughts about stories, but I find the subject very, very exciting at the moment. And I think there's something so fundamental about a kind of storytelling. And I think what can easily happen in business is that stories get turned into a tool that you use to make a certain thing happen. So I think, there are people who will train you in how to tell a certain kind of story to have a particular kind of impact on people.
Yes.
So you get, storytelling for better profits, storytelling for higher employee retention.
I don't do those kind of stories.
Yeah, but I think we are all natural storytellers.
Yes.
If story is relating our experience in some kind of sequence, I haven't thought about this very deeply, but I suppose that's what it is. So in an unhurried conversation, so whether you're doing that process I'm talking about, or in a good conversation, you'll find that people start sharing their experiences in stories.
Yes.
And I think they're kind of fundamental to how we understand the world, how we share our stories with each other. But I think it's a much more humble, earthy, connecting process.
Yes.
And I think we get a bit distracted, I think, by the finished stories of novels and movies and so on, all of which are lovely, but it's the story, it's the telling of the story and how we share in the stories, and how we we sometimes in a way we sometimes finish each other's stories. And I don't mean we jump in and grab it from someone, but it's like when we were talking about resonance. I suppose resonance was I told a story about nourishment, and you told your own story about nourishment, and we bounced off each other. I think that was all a form of this. This is all a form of storytelling. A conversation is, I suppose, a series of stories being exchanged.
Exactly. And for me, what came out of that is most all of the conversations, well, not all, but a lot of the conversations, I begin with a story. And it's usually a short, 1 or 2 minute story. Sometimes it's longer, but depending on the environment and the people. But what I say to people before I tell the story is that after I share the story, I'm going to ask you what you heard yourself say to yourself during the story.
Oh, ooh.
I stumbled on this.
I like that.
I did a presentation for several thousand people in Singapore once, a number of years ago. And when I was I wasn't feeling particularly well on this day. And as I got to the stage, I was lost. Luckily, I'm a good pauser. So in that was probably 30 seconds, I decided what came out of my mouth was, what I have to say to you today is important, but nowhere near as important as what you hear yourself say to yourself, and then who you become and what you do next. And immediately they all leaned in. And I've been using that as an opening line ever since, 15 years or more. And it's the same in the Wise Leaders conversations. I will start with a story, or somebody else will start with a story, and then we have a conversation about what we heard ourselves say to ourselves during the story. And the conversation flows from there. Now that's a process that works every time. But I agree with you. The best conversations are a series of stories that people are able to respond to from their hearts.
I think what you also touch on there is, it's very easy to talk about changing oneself and changing the organization as if these are separate things. But they're not. They're interconnected. If you want to get good at setting boundaries with other people, you simultaneously have to, in a way, have boundaries with yourself, catch yourself in certain behaviors and change them. Create a boundary for yourself to create boundaries with others. And I've been thinking more about this because I think it's often presented as if it's a choice. Some people will say, stop trying to change people and just redesign your organization to work more efficiently, which I think there is a lot of wisdom in. But there's also, if you're a leader, what's your motivation ultimately for changing the organization? I think it won't work, and I think it'll be boring if you aren't changing something in yourself. You have to change something in yourself to bring about a change in. I may not be putting this very well, but I think that echoes what you're saying, is that we're engaged in paying attention to the stories we're telling each other and ourselves.
Yes. I'm of the belief that all change is personal first, and then it's relationship change, and organizational change is a distant third.
Yeah. Well, it's probably easier. It's easier to change ourselves, isn't it? In terms of difficulty, if I get when I'm lying awake at night worrying, I realize, well, I can't do anything about the external world at the moment. So worrying about that right now feels really futile. What can I change?
Yeah, indeed.
At 3 a.m. on my own in bed, I probably better work on my own responses.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Well, Johnny, it's been a wonderful conversation. I greatly appreciate it. Folks, I'll put links to Johnny's books and website underneath the video when it's up on YouTube in a day or two. But Johnny, thanks so much.
Thanks, Ian. Isn't it amazing to be able to do this across 10,000 miles and not even think about it? What a wonderful thing this technology can be. Having lambasted it, isn't it great that we can do this?
Absolutely. Absolutely.